and you do a speech to the group after you get the award. And as we walked out of the thing, like everybody in the meeting, it's like, you know, all the people whose papers and books you're reading, it's kind of this thing. Everybody's like walking on the way up to the hallway saying, "Did you understand that?" Gisela is originally German, I think, scholar. She has more kind of German philosopher, scholar sort of style. But she did write a review for the annual review of geriatrics and gerontology a few years ago, where she explained that the kind of the things that originally guided her thinking was Piaget's approach to cognitive development and Freud's approach to emotional development, and then trying to extend those into midlife and beyond. And I thought, oh, well, at least I sort of get what it is that she's up to. I'm not always trying to understand what she's saying about what she's found out. But a simple version, probably a very oversimplified version, what she's saying is that as you get more cognitively complex with adult development, you're more able to handle your emotions, so that actually being able to advance from that kind of pure and intense state of emotion where you maybe get back somewhat from an older person's perspective, kind of driven by and battered around by your own emotional states to a large degree, that as you get more experience and develop more cognitive complexity moving into adulthood and middle age, that you're able to understand your emotions more deeply and also therefore able to control, attenuate, moderate your emotions in a more it must be a 2 o'clock.
It waits for you every week.
Is there a connection between like intelligence and ability to control different emotions? Because it just reminds me of like, you know, the dads at like soccer practice or a baseball game, or that hockey dad that killed the other one. I mean, whenever you hear an interview with them, they don't sound like smart people.
I think, offhand, I can't think of anybody who makes a direct connection between intelligence in the sense that we were talking about a couple of weeks ago in emotion. What Gisela would argue, which would be distinct but similar to what you were just saying, is that you have to have attained this kind of higher stage of cognitive complexity, which would be, it's just sort of a different theory, a different set of concepts than intelligence in the kind of 5 or 2 or 1 factor sense we were talking about a couple of weeks ago. So it is kind of more Piagetian in the sense that you think of, and you move from concrete operations to formal operations, post-formal, and so forth, and that you're in principle qualitatively able to conceptualize your experience in more sophisticated and nuanced ways. And so I'm sure that Gisela would think of the hockey dads as being at a more childlike or possibly early adolescent stage of cognitive development, and therefore unable to control that emotional complexity. Although, and this becomes a real issue as she applies her ideas to later life. She also argues at times that this, once you've gotten to a certain level of cognitive complexity and that sense of control is well established, that you can and may choose to voluntarily suspend control, and so that it may make sense that older adults under certain circumstances may, in some sense, voluntarily experience more sadness or other negatively balanced emotions, knowing that they can control it. And so that, arguably for those of you that are fairly young in the room, that part of your reluctance to experience negatively balanced emotion is because you don't have control over it. But if you knew that you could decide how much and how long and how you were going to moderate it, and write it out, like you're surfing the waves. There might be circumstances in which it would make a lot of sense to let it go. Yeah.
I was also going to just add, maybe kind of related, is I find personally when I'm tired, for example, I have less ability to regulate my emotions and kind of react in ways that I wouldn't normally. And so I feel like your cognitive abilities when you're tired go down, and your ability. So.
I mean, being tired, being sick, being intoxicated, any and all of those things sort of throw you to different cognitive levels.
And then it's related to.
It also can directly affect your emotional state. And other things being equal, because when you're very fatigued or sick in a way that drains your energy, you're going to be driven towards low arousal kinds of states. Most people experience that as also negatively valenced aspect of things going on. There certainly are people who, for developmental historical reasons, seem to enjoy being sick and associate it with being taken care of. Take you out in other directions. So, and again, for Giesel, as for Carstensen and some other theorists, the emotional complexity side, it does include this notion that you can have very complicated emotional reactions that might span several discrete emotions, and it could easily span mixes of emotions that would be negatively and positively valenced, whatever that might mean. There's lots of room. Okay, social networks. We know social networks are smaller in later life. And actually, one of the early things in some of Laura Carstensen's earliest writings that evolved towards her socio-emotional selectivity theory, the sort of lifespan research on social networks actually suggests a much earlier point in life at which social networks get smaller. I think that early on, we thought that it was, along with thinking that older people are sad, as part of the popular conventional wisdom that older people are isolated socially. Which for the most part, gerontology research has kind of been debunking for about the last 40 years. 40. Starting with family stuff, and then I think like friendship networks and so forth. But networks are smaller, but probably start being smaller and different from about age 30 onward. The different part meaning that somewhere after you settled into full-on adult social role kind of life, meaning establishing family, being in your working environment, and so forth, your social networks tend to be predominantly family and really good friends, whereas for adolescents and young adults, tend to have larger networks, but a lot of acquaintances and a lot of less close friends in social networks. And there's this kind of early question. People sort of assume, well, if your social network was smaller, then you ought to have lower life satisfaction. This is kind of, one version of activity theory. Or it was one of the observations that this didn't always happen. It's sort of consistent with the early proposals of disengagement theory. You have in the Lawton and Salthouse readings from the day some of the early articles and chapters from both Henry and Havighurst and colleagues. Henry representing the disengagement theory viewpoint, and Havighurst, Newgarden, etc. Sort of either on this, sort of a mix of on the activity theory side to on the older adults have different kinds of personalities, and some people like activity and some people like disengagement sort of side.